There's an old saying, an army marches on it. Yeah, I'm in the army. It's true though, isn't it? That's what they say. An army marches on its stomach. And whatever that is meant to mean, basically the way I understand it is that if an army doesn't feed its soldiers, it's not going anywhere. Because keeping soldiers active, keeping them well-nourished, is very, very important. I don't know whether you watch these programs. I love these programs on television where they kind of follow a set of guys who are training for the Marines and stuff like that. There's one on one of the channels at the moment. It's just fascinating to watch and to see how much food these guys need to be able to carry on their work. They're just burning so many calories. So one of the logistics problems that an army faces, of course, is how do you get food to the troops? And I had a friend in my last church who had been in the catering corps, and he would tell stories of how fairly near the front line they would set up these catering units and they would feed the troops. And it was an amazing exercise. But you probably know that back in World War II, certainly, one of the ways that the British military tried to solve the issue was by giving military personnel, I'm sure, Trevor, you would have had these, you had rations. You were given rations. And sea rations was one of the things that they called them. They weren't particularly nutritious. Reading some articles this past week, a lot of the guys described them as blinking awful. But they weren't exactly the sort of thing that you'd write home and say, oh yes, I had a lovely, lovely whatever it was. The theoretical daily rations for a British, this is theory, the theoretical daily rations were 20 ounces of bread, 16 ounces of flour instead of bread, some lime if vegetables, some rum. Do you have rum on the ships? There was rum available on the ships, wasn't there? 4 ounces of dried fruit, some pepper, some mustard, some veg, dried veg, tea, jam. I mean, that's not very much, is it? And certainly, I know I'm on a diet, but I think that's ridiculous. But I was thinking this last week, the Bible is full of references to Christians as soldiers. It's something that you hear again and again when you read bits of the Bible. So Paul, for instance, in Philemon, talks about a guy there called Agrippus, and he refers to him as a fellow soldier. Epaphroditus in Philippians is described as my brother, fellow worker, and fellow soldier. Now, these guys weren't in the military, but this term, soldier, is used to describe a Christian. They were not the kind of kumbaya, sandal-wearing, brown polo-necked kind of Colgate sweet smile people. We are described as Christians as soldiers. That's the language. In Timothy, when he writes to Timothy, Paul says, look, you've got to endure hardship with us like a good soldier. For goodness sake, man, stop being a crybaby. Pull your socks up, get on with it. That's the picture that's being given of the Christian and the Christian life. We are soldiers. So our old hymns, some of you have grown up in church, or some of you perhaps not grown up in church may well be familiar with some of the old hymns. Like a mighty army moves the church. I once heard that hymn, though, called Like a Mighty Tortoise Moves the Church of God. Not much like an army, but there we go. What about stand up for Jesus? He's soldiers of the cross. So even the hymns picked up on this idea that we are soldiers. Look at you. Soldiers? Thank you, Chesky. That's right. Soldiers, I mean, but that's the way the Bible describes us. Soldiers. And it's not just a picture so that rather than a ragtag bunch of misfits, we see ourselves as a strong, mighty bunch of people. We are also to understand that from a spiritual perspective, we are an army. We are deployed by God on this planet Earth to do some stuff, to make a difference, to be an army of people who get involved and get dirty and sometimes get wounded and even killed for standing up for the right thing. So if Christians withdrew from NGOs throughout the world, non-government organizations that provide things like famine relief, medical aid and support in countries that are suffering from incredible disasters, like in Haiti where there was the earthquake, Sierra Leone where there's been a terrific civil war, even if you go into places like Afghanistan. If Christians withdrew from those situations, most, if not all, of those works would come to an end. Christians are called to get involved, get dirty, knuckle down, and help. Contend against the bad stuff that happens on this earth. We are to contend for truth. We are to stand on the side of the poor. We are to fight for the marginalized. We are to stand up for justice. And these are very, very important things, particularly to us as Baptists. If you know nothing about Baptist history, we as a bunch of nonconformists, we did that. And long through our history has been this whole thing of standing, making a difference, fighting alongside those who can't fight for themselves. No wonder that the battlefield analogy is taken further by Paul in Ephesians 6. We're told to put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. So we are soldiers. You and I are soldiers. You get that? That's what the Bible describes Christians as. And we're at war. So we're involved in this battle. We're a bunch of soldiers. We need to eat. Yes? We need not just drink. I know it's hot and you want to drink. All right? But we need to eat as well. The thing is, what are we going to eat? Well, Jesus has supplied a very special meal for us. Ta-da! It's this. See, the danger is that you kind of just view all of this stuff that's set up here once in a while. We call it communion. That you kind of see it as some sort of, afterthought, some kind of religious thing that we do, some sort of, a bit of an empty tradition or something. Is there something more to this, though, than perhaps meets the eye? Is there something that perhaps as Christians we should understand about communion? Is there something significant about this meal? It's sometimes called the breaking of bread. If you're from a Brethren background, certainly that's what you'd be used to. If you're from a Church of Wales background or a Presbyterian background, you might be used to it being called the Eucharist. In Baptist circles, we tend to call it communion or the Lord's Supper. It's variously described. And I think this is to be our rations as Christian soldiers. This is the stuff that God wants us to seriously take in so that we can fight for the cause of Jesus. The early church certainly took this meal very seriously, which is why I asked Beth to read those two passages. Because in both of those passages, reference is made to communion. So in Acts 2:42, you'll notice that the early church, they're met together. What did they do? They didn't run, actually, children's programs and ministry programs in different places. The main things they did, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the fellowship, in other words, to being together and meeting together, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. That's what they did as an early church. That's where they devoted their attention. Acts chapter 20, the early church has moved on a few years. Things are progressing well. On the first day of the week, Luke tells us we came together. Why? Why did we come? To break bread. That was the key thing that they did. That's why they were meeting together. Every academic I read says the same thing. When the early church spoke about breaking bread, it was their way of saying communion, Eucharist, Lord's Supper, whatever you may want to call it. And they did it pretty regularly. A Christian leader from around 150 AD, named Justin Martyr, wrote, on Sunday, a meeting is held of all who live in the cities and villages. And at the close of the meeting, they focus on the bread and wine and give thanks for them. And the congregation answers, Amen! And the elements are distributed to each one and partaken of, and are carried by the deacons, this is an interesting one, to the houses of the absent. So those who aren't there get communion taken to them. And certainly some of you who are older may well remember that being done. Certainly in some local congregations, in rural contexts, that was very often done, where communion would be taken out to people and delivered to them. Farmers who couldn't get to chapel on a Sunday would often have communion brought to them by the pastor or deacons during the week. I always find it interesting there, that last verse that I've quoted up there in verse 7 of Acts 20. On the first day of the week we came together to break bread. In other words, if you look at that, the reason they were at church on the first day of the week was to break bread. That's why they were there. And I find that incredibly odd and interesting, because Paul was there. And he was quite famous. And he was well known as a speaker. And I'm sure that everybody would wanted to hear him. But it's interesting. He wasn't the reason they'd gathered. He was a bit of the after-dinner speaker sort of thing, really. He was something to have after the main event. Because the main event was that they came together to break bread. So why? Why is this so important? Why do I believe that this isn't just some kind of thing we tack on at the end of the service? Why is it that sometimes of a service you'll know, particularly of an evening, I'll bring it into the heart of our service rather than just having it as the last thing and then bye-bye and we're off? Well, what is it about this that perhaps makes it so important? And particularly on a Sunday when we're receiving new members in, I think it's good to just focus on this a little bit this morning. I think there are two things I can think of as to why it's so important. The first is this. I honestly believe that Jesus is here. And that when we come and sit here this morning, truthfully, whether there's communion here or not, Jesus is present amongst us. But I do particularly believe that he's here now. Not that these are magical. This is not magic. This is bread and wine. So don't think that in some way, this is the body and this is the blood. No, I don't understand it in that way. But I do believe Jesus is present amongst us. Every time we gather together, Jesus is here. And whether we do this in Moriah, or maybe I bring it to your home, or as I've done on a busy dual carriageway in the middle of Romania at 6 o'clock in the morning, I've broken bread with people. Or whether you're sat in a dusty hospital called Guinea-Bissau 2 in the middle of Chad and the temperature's 50 degrees, I believe that Jesus is present when you meet together. Jesus said, didn't he, when 2 or 3 gather in my name, there I am, in the midst of them. If I didn't believe that there's something special about us meeting together on a Sunday morning at 11 o'clock, quite frankly, I would stay in bed. Wouldn't you? I mean, unless there's something significant and special about us meeting together, I've got other things to be doing. I've got other things that I could fill my time with. But I believe that when we meet together, Jesus meets with us. That this is more than just a meeting. That this isn't a club. This isn't a thing for mutually minded people. This is a church. This is a gathering of people. And when we meet together in the name of Jesus, he has said, look, I'll be there. I will be with you. The second thing is, communion table is where you and I are reminded of our mission. If you're checking Christianity out, if you're not sure what Christianity is all about, boom. This is where you can engage with what Christianity is actually all about. This is a stark reminder to all of us, whether we're checking Christianity out, still going along our spiritual journey, or whether we're dyed-in-the-wool campaigners. We've been Christians a long, long time. Hey, this is a good reminder for us. Every time we celebrate communion here, or most of the time that we celebrate communion here as a church, I'll read these words that are on the screen. Words that Paul uses to the church in Corinth, saying to them about what they're to do when they come and celebrate communion. And he reminds them that this is what Jesus did. It isn't something he's made up as a church leader. This is something he's doing because Jesus did it. So he says, look, on the night when Jesus was betrayed, he took bread, and when he'd given thanks, he broke it. He said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And in the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant or agreement in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. And then Paul adds those lovely little words, whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. You proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Communion reminds us why we're here. On any given Sunday morning, the songs may not suit you. You may not like these new songs. You may not particularly enjoy the way that they go. You may not feel that the organ is played enough. You may not be happy that I am stood here in a t-shirt rather than a suit. Fine. But friends, can I say to you, seriously, Jesus is here. Jesus is here, and you might be bored. You might wonder, when on earth is this guy going to wind up so I can get home? But the bread and the cup will remind you, Jesus is here, and he died for you. And he died for me. That's what this is all about. It's not hocus pocus nonsense. It's not empty tradition. It's a stark reminder of what Christianity is actually all about. It reminds us that you and I muck up. We often talk about the human propensity to always muck things up. Can you identify with that? Yeah? Why do I do the things I know I shouldn't do? Why do I leave undone the stuff that I know I should have gone and done? Why does stuff come out of my gob and then I'm like, why did I say that? Bible wraps all of that up and calls it sin. It says that's what it is. It's sin. And it separates us from God. Gets in the way. Lots of people spend their lives trying to get to God. And they kind of invent in their minds a kind of ladder of achievement and attainment. And so as we saw with the young people the other week, it's all about helping old people across the road, is it? It's all about being kind and generous. The problem is, where's the cutoff? Do some people just make it into heaven by the skin of their teeth? Do some people just miss the mark? Oh, they were so close, but no cigar. Is that what it is? Or is it actually about God saying, you can't get to me. I'll come to you. And he steps down from the glory and majesty of heaven, and he comes and he's born as a vulnerable baby in Bethlehem. And suddenly God is amongst us, and God is working, and God is revealing his plans and his purposes. And upon himself he takes the filth and the rubbish and that sin. And he says, do you know what? I'll deal with it once and for all. So that you're either in or you're not. It's clear cut. Here's the reminder. A man bears in his body, represented by bread, the rubbish in your life. The nonsense in mine. Takes it all upon himself. Oh, God should actually say to Marc Owen, stuff you. Get lost. Stuff you've done. And yet he puts all of that stuff on his son Jesus. And Jesus' blood is shed for us. Because the Bible had said a long time ago, there can never be forgiveness without the shedding of blood. Blood is the life thing, isn't it? You know, you can bleed out, there's no life in you anymore. And so blood is shed to cleanse, wash away sin. Here's the reminder. This is what it's about. We're not here to be entertained. Oh, we're here to enjoy ourselves. Of course we are, don't get me wrong. But we're here for a much bigger reason. We're here because Jesus died to forgive us, to change our lives. And many of us sat here this morning have experienced that. And what a joy and a privilege it was to baptize Victoria and John the other Sunday as they witnessed and testified to the change that has come in their lives because of what Jesus has done. Communion is the part of worship where we can depend on God reminding us why we're here and what we've been commissioned to do, to tell other people. I want everybody to know what God has done for them. I want everybody to come and experience the joy, the self-worth, the security, the significance that I enjoy in my life because of Jesus. Little wonder then the early Christian church took communion far more often than perhaps we do. It would appear as you read through the book of Acts and early church history, they pretty much did it every week. And bear in mind, this was the most important part of their worship. It's why they gathered. It's almost as if they would understand that they were starving spiritually if they missed a Sunday at the table. If we miss a Sunday, if we miss communion, does it bother us? Maybe we've lost a certain understanding of what this is all about. One of the things that the creators of the early sea rations didn't actually realize was that their limited calories in those meals meant that the guys who were fighting really suffered from fatigue because they weren't taking in enough to sustain them in battle. It was okay if you were just strolling around camp and doing a bit of marching and saluting and stuff. But as soon as you were out on the front line, fighting, contending for your life, living rough, going days maybe without sleep and having to march and yomp and do all of those things with a heavy kit on your back, suddenly they were burning off more calories than they consumed. And it was going to hurt them over the long haul. And that's why our modern army has now updated the calorie intake. And the modern meal looks a lot different. This is the basic rations that a lot of British soldiers carry. You can't see it very clearly, but there are familiar brands there. There's Kenko coffee. There you are, you're fighting the Afghanistans. Chaps, coffee? Have you got any Kenko? Because I don't like that Nescafe rubbish. Oh yeah. Thai Fu tea. Not any nonsense tea. Thai Fu. Mini bottles of Tabasco. You didn't have that in your day, eh, Trev? Dear me. Main courses include the British favourite, chicken tikka masala. It's most favourite meal in Britain. Chicken tikka masala. A vegetarian pasta for the week. Pork and beans for breakfast. Lots of sweets and snacks. Trail mix. To an apple fruit pocket. Whatever that is. Packets of polos. They thought of everything. You imagine the enemy, in Afghanistan, the Taliban are there. Oh, they're coming and they've got their polos. Look out. But the whole idea is energy. Energy to sustain them for the fight. And they can go in and they can do their working and burn the calories. And stuff's coming and they're having more. And so it carries on. Little wonder that the early church apparently felt that taking communion just once in a while wasn't going to supply them enough spiritual calories to help them in the daily conflict. So I want to make a challenge to you. When we celebrate communion, make every effort to come. Make every effort to be here. It's important we break bread together. This is an important meal. It's why, as a church, we receive new members in here at communion. Because we recognize we're in a battle and we need feeding up and strengthening, and we share this together, and then we can go into the real world. There's one more thing that caught my attention here. It says, on the first day of the week, they came together to break bread. I love that There's a common misconception today. People will often say to me, I believes in God, but I don't go to church. You don't have to go to church to believe in God. And I've got to be honest and say, you're absolutely right. You don't have to go to church to believe in God. Of course you don't. But I think they're missing out on something. They view Christianity as something they can do all by themselves. This is a picture I've shown you before, but they kind of have a view of Christianity that it's a bit like a Lone Ranger mission, a religion that they can practice in the corner somewhere. It doesn't work, though. As many of us sat in this room right now have experienced, we can go through stages in our lives where we kind of withdraw and we kind of think, I need time out. And it doesn't work. We need the company of people. And one of the things that expresses that is right here now, communion. This is something for us to do together, to share together. The word communion comes from the Greek word koinonia, or koinonia, depending on how you want to pronounce it. It literally means a having in common, a koinos, a partnership, a fellowship. Communion is meant, therefore, to be a shared experience. It's the time when God's army gets together to prepare for battle. We gain strength from our numbers and power from our unity. It's us saying, all for one and one for all. Yeah? Some of you are tired this morning, aren't you? It's the Three Musketeers. It declares we need each other. The Lord's table is a time when we can be together and share koinonia. Of course, just because all the troops gather under one roof to eat together doesn't mean we don't tend to fight amongst ourselves, rather than fighting with the army. That's what I love about those programs behind the scenes when they watch the Marines all training and everything. Oh, they fall out with each other. Church is never like that, is it? If only. I remember hearing of one congregation where the hatred had run so deep between different factions in the church. One lot quite literally sat on one side of the chapel, and one lot quite literally sat on the other side of the chapel. And they still did this. What a mockery. I mean, that is making that just empty ritual and tradition, and that's what we do on the first and third Sundays, so fine. Is that what this is? I mean, I know it looks like a bit like a packed lunch, doesn't it, But hasn't it got to mean something? Isn't there something of significance here? If we're falling out with each other, there isn't a good spirit amongst us. God knows our hearts. Jesus once said, if you're offering your gift at the altar and you there remember that your brother has something against you, hey, leave your gift there. Go, be reconciled to your brother. Then come and offer your gift. Essentially, Jesus is saying, look, if you've got conflict going on between you and somebody else, you need to get that sorted. In the church at Corinth, people tried taking communion while mistreating other Christians. Paul was very straight with them. He said, that's why many of you are weak and sick, and a number of you have fallen asleep. In other words, many of them have died. They were taking communion whilst they hated each other's guts. That's not what this is about. God takes this seriously. Hates it when people hurt each other. Communion should be a time when we close our ranks. A time when we should watch each other's backs. God demands that we fight the enemy and not each other. So Paul tells us a man ought to examine himself before he eats of the bread and drinks of the cup. And that's exactly what I want to do as we prepare to come to share bread and wine this morning. I want us to take a moment in quietness and in reflection to look at our own lives. So as we come and take the communion this morning, we'll do so in an attitude that's right before God. Let's do that. Let's bow our heads for a moment as we pray. And in the silence, let God's Spirit search your heart. And if there are things that you're aware of that you need forgiveness for, ask God for those things to be forgiven. The Bible tells us, it makes a lovely promise. It says, if we confess our sin, he is faithful and just and will forgive us our sin and purify us from all unrighteousness. So let's be honest with God in the quietness of our hearts. Let's examine ourselves before we come this morning to eat and drink.